What's up, everybody? It's me again. This time I'm drawing some snake titties. Yeah. Okay, so this is Tuki from Shantae, which I am completely hyped up for the next Shantae game, and I can't wait for it to come out. So I did this fan art and this little GIF, and this GIF wound up taking me 5.5 to 6 hours, I can't remember. But basically it took me a long time and it's only 12 frames, so yeah, enjoy it. Oh yeah, and also on the note of the pronunciation of GIF, I know that there's going to be people arguing in the comments, so here's a little interesting tidbit. The original creator wanted it to be GIF, pronounced like a J sound, specifically so he could make a pun off of the peanut butter. Like literally one of his quotes was, "Choosy developers choose GIFs." So that's why I use GIF, because I think that's funny. Anyway, so today what I'm going to talk about a bit is I'm going to talk about critique and feedback, how to respond to it, and how to also give it, especially because usually the issue with a lot of people isn't necessarily receiving critique, but the critique that's given just frankly is not good. And if you try to contest it, people immediately jump to the conclusion that, oh, you can't take critique, or oh, you need to accept feedback and stuff. And it's like, I'm just going to clarify some misconceptions because I've been doing this for a very, very, very long time, and critique is very useful, usually, but it has to be smart. So, first I'm going to talk about how to respond to critique. Obviously, you do not want to be overly defensive of your stuff. A lot of artists, one of the biggest examples that people will always cite, and this is actually a really common one, especially with more novice artists, is when you receive critique, especially like when it comes to like artistic anatomy, one common defense is, oh, it's just my style. It's not an anatomy issue. I meant to do that. It's a style choice. The thing is, with anatomy and style specifically, anatomy is not dictated by style. Rather, style is how you represent anatomy, if that makes sense. You can choose to simplify things, and that can be a stylistic choice, but usually anatomy is going to be more related to consistency and proportions rather than just the general appearance of your thing. So if you make a torso too long, that's not a stylistic choice. That's just a mistake. There's no getting around that. So be mindful of that. At the same time, sometimes when people do give critiques on anatomy and stuff, they will fail to take into account certain stylistic choices and stuff that was intentionally done. For instance, if somebody was drawn like in panty and stocking style, so where the wrists are basically completely flush, and then somebody goes on and says, oh, you need to make sure that the wrists are pronounced, that's not really a helpful critique because that's not something that the artist is trying to objectively do. That's not something that's in their goal. One other good thing that you can also do when responding to critique is kind of like figure out how to question the critique and how to get more information out of it. For instance, if somebody says that they don't like a certain aspect, ask them to clarify what specifically they think you could do better. For instance, if it comes to like voice acting and stuff, if somebody says like they don't like an interpretation you have on a voice, say they're like, oh, I don't like who you casted for this voice or something, you can respond to them directly and say, well, what would you rather the voice sounded like, or what do you think that I could do instead? Because sometimes people will make statements that basically, and try to pass them off as critique that just, quite frankly, are not critique. They're just opinionated statements, and that's all. They don't actually have anything that you can actually go off of. That's one of the big goals that critique honestly needs to focus on, is the goal needs to be not to voice your opinion, it needs to be to help you improve. And that's what a lot of people wind up forgetting when they do give critique. And honestly, as I go on with this topic and stuff, you'll probably start to realize that, hey, some of the best things that you can do to receive critique better is to just learn how to give critique in of itself, because then you can kind of piece apart what people tell you and you can kind of get better information from them, stuff like that. Also, when responding to critique, one thing that you are free to do as an artist is you're free to tell somebody that you're not going to basically use their advice on certain parts. Obviously, if you do that for everything, it's going to look like you're just being arrogant, but let's be honest, you're not going to be able to adapt every single change that people suggest. And oftentimes, people are going to be asking you to put in more work onto something that, quite frankly, you can't really spend much more time on. I've had some cases where people have asked me to go through and redo an animation I did years ago and add in all this new information and all this new stuff when the animation's already had its heyday. If I were to re-upload it, even if I updated it and did like an HD version, it's very unlikely that it would wind up taking off and would wind up being a smart venture. People kind of tend to forget that while we do a lot of what we do out of the love for it, we still need to kind of make sure that our expenses are taken care of, that we're getting the exposure we need so that way we can get freelance work or commissions. We can't spend all this time working on a single project that's already been released and go back and make a whole bunch of changes to it and completely rework it. That's not going to really be efficient in most cases. Sometimes that will be actually the case where you can actually go back and do that because that's something that you plan to do from the start. But usually advice is going to have to be on stuff that we can do in the future rather than how we can perpetually modify something and keep trying to make it perfect. If you're trying to attain perfection on a single thing, you're never going to reach it. That's just a very blunt principle, and nobody has the time for that. One final little tidbit I want to talk about as far as receiving critique is just a few things not to do. Obviously, don't get pouty and don't get overly defensive. I've pointed that out already. But like, some common excuses are like, oh, I'm young, I'm inexperienced, or I'm not a professional, I'm just doing this for fun. That's not really a reason to reject critique and reject ways to improve. Because, I mean, let's be honest. Usually when people give critique, even if they're not being good at it, their goal is going to be to help you. So you gotta kind of respect that. As I pointed out, don't try to defend mistakes as being intentional unless they definitely were something that you intended to do and that they actually weren't mistakes at all. There's nothing wrong with actually explaining your reasoning and what you did for certain aspects, but just be mindful of how you're phrasing it because you want to make sure that people understand that you're just providing them more information so you can get better information in turn. It shouldn't be like you trying to justify mistakes that you've made. One real simple example is one VA that I work with. I was having her do a gruff voice for an animation, and somebody was saying that she should have been gruffer. And well, I do kind of wish that the animation was a little bit gruffer. I also didn't want her to hurt herself because that would put her out of commission for a few days, and she has to do work on her own as well. So that wouldn't really be fair. But that's not something that people would necessarily know, so I guess it's still kind of fair as a critique. But likewise, it's also fair for me and her to tell them that, hey, we would have done this differently, but just didn't want to hurt her. As far as giving critique goes, there's actually more to talk about on this because, quite frankly, I think if you understand how to give critique, you're going to be able to better receive critique because you'll kind of understand where people are coming from more. And at the same time, there's just more aspects that are, as I've said before, more people have trouble giving critique than they do receiving critique. People receiving critique is still an issue, don't get me wrong, but again, there's bad critique out there, a lot of it. As I said, one of the biggest issues when people start to question critique or try to critique a critique, yeah, you didn't know that could happen, huh? Critique can be subjected to critique itself. But usually the first thing that people will default to is red herring arguments saying like, oh, you just want to be hugboxed or positive comments only. And that's such a cop-out. It's just aggravating how many times people will default to that when you say like, hey, this critique is being too harsh or this critique is not being helpful. People are free to disagree with your critique, and if you get defensive over your critique, you are just as bad as people who don't take any critique at all. So I'm going to just cover a few general topics regarding giving back critique, and I'll go into detail on them, but first and foremost, I want to talk about subjectivity, because oftentimes what a lot of people, especially less experienced people, misunderstand is something that you find personally, that you might personally take an issue with, you have to make sure that it's something that is actually an issue and not just your preference. For instance, when it comes to voice acting, this is actually where this plays into a significant degree. When somebody doesn't like an interpretation of a voice, but the voice itself is fine, that's a subjective argument and stuff. If they're saying that the voice actor should have been cast differently, like let me just give an example. Say you have one voice that's done in an animation and it's very, very gruff, and it's like very deep, intimidating voice. If somebody wanted something that was more mature sounding and more dark sounding, that's not a matter of, oh, this is what the voice actor can do better. That's more a matter of, oh, this is what I like more. Why aren't you sounding like this? And that's not really fair because that's completely subjective and it's based on an interpretation of a voice, not based on how the voice is performing. Another aspect that also frequently comes up with critique and feedback is the matter of comparisons. Comparisons generally are not going to be a useful way to give critique. What can be useful is examples, and you got to kind of find the balancing act between those. If you're saying, oh, voice actor A doesn't sound like voice actor B, or, oh, why are you drawing like this instead of drawing like this person? That's not really going to be that helpful. However, if, say, you imagine like, oh, I imagine this character as having a little bit more refinement to her voice, such as in this example, and then you post a link to a video or audio clip from some TV show, or even something that another voice actor has done, but you're specifically saying that it's about the refinement of the voice, or some other quality of the voice, specifically focusing on a quality, that's very helpful in turn. Likewise, if you're working as an artist, or you're working with an artist and you're critiquing an artist and you're telling them, hey, the lighting, I would kind of imagine that the lighting would go more this direction, or there would be ambience that looks more like this, and then you show an example that's similar to theirs, and then you kind of point out what the differences are, that's going to be more useful than just telling somebody, be this instead of being this. Also in line with that is the idea of making objective statements about stuff that you can't say for certain. This is actually a really big one, and this might seem a little bit like word policing, but I'm just asking, like, it's just a small change to make, and it really does help, and it makes a world of difference. Instead of saying something like, this is bad, say, I don't like this. Make it personal. Make it seem like, oh hey, this is my opinion, this is not a fact. Because I know I was talking about subjectivity and stuff. Realistically, every single critique is going to have some level of subjectivity to it. So you just need to keep in mind that when you're making any statements on the quality and properties of some work, you just need to make sure that it's understood that this is what you feel, and this is how you're responding to it. Because otherwise, if you're trying to say something's objectively bad, it doesn't seem like you're very aware of what you're critiquing. Think of things as less of being like good versus bad, and think of them more as being weak versus strong, if that makes sense. What did people do? What are aspects that are weaker in the work, and what are aspects that are stronger? That's kind of just a better mindset to take with this kind of stuff, and it makes your statements basically look a lot more receivable and a lot more rational. Another aspect to talk about, and this one I'm probably not going to spend too much time on because it's really fucking obvious. Don't be a dick. Like, there are some people who think that them being smart alecks or smart asses and just being generally rude somehow makes them sound more intelligent. And that's the most fucking pretentious thing ever. If you're being rude and you're insulting somebody you're critiquing, they're not going to listen to your critique, and they don't have to put up with your shit. It's just being unnecessarily dickish. You're not making yourself receptive, you're doing a very bad job of critiquing. One of the big objectives when it comes to critique and feedback is to make sure that you're being understood and you're being received. You don't have to be a dick to do that. In fact, that's actually completely counterintuitive to the critique. Usually these are the kind of people who, then when you point out that they're being dicks, they're like, oh, you need to learn to take critique. And it's like, no, you need to learn to take critique, and also fuck you, your mother was a whore and your father smelt of elderberries or something. I don't know. But too long didn't read, they're fucking assholes, and they shouldn't be giving critiques. So one final aspect I want to talk about, and this is kind of one of the hardest ones to kind of cope with and kind of work around, because it's just really hard to understand because you can't read minds. You need to understand what the objective of the art is. Probably the clearest example I can give, if somebody's doing a crappy little sketch and they post it and share it somewhere, that's not grounds for you to go off and give like a critique, an advanced level critique of it as if they're trying to draw a Picasso. If someone's doing like a dramatic dialogue sequence, part of your critique shouldn't be, well, why didn't they go to a fight sequence as well? Because that's completely outside of the scope. On that note, a lot of times when critiques do wind up coming to those faults, usually it's going to be a statement like, why isn't this bigger, or why isn't this more impressive? And to be honest, that translates to, as an animator or an artist or whatever have you, it more translates to, why didn't you spend more time on this? Why did you spend only 2 weeks on this versus 2 months, etc.? And that kind of helps bring it more into perspective, because a lot of projects, they do have timelines on them, and you don't want to spend, as I said, years or months upon months working on a single project. again, if you're in this field and stuff, you need to regularly be producing content and stuff, and that doesn't always mean you can spend 5 months on every single project you do. Big projects do definitely have a place, don't get me wrong, but you got to understand that that's the artist's choice, whether they want to work on big stuff like that or not. A few other small things before wrapping up here. There's also don't try to critique aspects that you don't really know anything about yourself. It just winds up it looks very try-hardy, essentially, and it's not something that people are going to be able to take seriously. Make sure that you just know what you're talking about, or try to keep it simple, essentially. That's the best way to go. Relating to this aspect as well is just another little concept. Try to avoid assuming things about whoever it is you're critiquing. Don't assume that you'd necessarily know what they're capable of or what their limitations are, especially if you don't know them personally or if you haven't worked with them before. It actually is helpful, believe it or not, if you can account for the limitations of a content creator, but if you don't know what those are, you can't really assume what they are. Try to keep your stuff open to interpretation both ways. For instance, if you think that a voice, I'm just going to use a voice acting example again, take a guess on where I may be getting these from. If you're saying that you imagine a voice being deeper, instead of assuming that the voice actor is not capable of reaching that low, just say that you imagine it being deeper. Don't need to beat around the bush and don't need to assume what their abilities are or patronize them for it. An artist or creator is going to understand their limitations better than you do. Also, you might notice that I didn't really talk about there's a common formula that people use called sandwiching when it comes to critique. They'll point out a positive aspect, then a negative aspect, then a positive aspect. I personally don't really like that method. I don't think it's really necessary. If your critique is good, it shouldn't matter whether it's positive or negative. It should still be helpful and it should still be receptive. Some common things that I'll do is I'll point out what the strengths are, I'll point out what the weaknesses are, and then I'll point out a host of different changes that are more lateral changes and might have been different options and describe what kind of effects they might have provided. They aren't necessarily oh, you should have done this differently. They're more hey, if you did this, if this is your goal, this will help you further that goal and further that objective. It's basically stuff that you could do completely differently. And that's where you can be a little bit more subjective, but you're acknowledging that you're being subjective and that it's not necessarily an objectively positive or negative change. It's something lateral. Probably need to record a little bit further because this was a really long project, and if I speed it up too much, you're not going to be able to tell what's going on. So I'm going to keep talking about critique. Two things more that I want to talk about are basically certain platforms where critique is common, and also on voice actors specifically. I'm going to start with voice actors, because this is more just a PSA than anything. I'm going to be completely honest. I've been animating and drawing for about 10 years now, and I've gone through a lot of critique and stuff. I've gone to kind of online art schools and stuff, and I've gone through critique courses and stuff like that. And I've noticed that VAs tend to kind of get the short end of the stick when it comes to feedback. People are more likely to, when it comes to critiquing art and animation and stuff, people are more likely to offer comments that are basically about the quality or things you can do differently, or the aspect of things that are within your control. When people critique voice actors, they're usually a lot more blunt and rude about it. I see more insults thrown at voice actors usually, and also more people advocating oh, you should have used somebody else, instead of telling the voice actor specifically what they could have done differently. So don't treat content creators as disposable for a project and stuff. Try to make sure that critique and stuff is focused on what they can do differently rather than who can be different, because that's just kind of me. It's not necessary at all. It's not helpful to anybody. Focus on what qualities can be changed, as stated earlier. And lastly, I want to just talk about platforms for critique, because the way a certain form is structured can also affect how critique is received. Newgrounds actually has a very good structure for it because everything is all chronological. This is also why sites like 4chan, believe it or not, are also really good for critique, because everybody is considered within the same worth. On sites like Reddit, however, Reddit usually is not going to be a good platform for critique, at least in most subreddits, especially fandom-based stuff and stuff that's not focused on artistic feedback and artistic development, because it has this hive mind mentality where a critique might get upvoted even if it's not accurate or if it's not helpful. And the problem is you're having people upvoting it, saying that they like it and stuff, who might not necessarily understand what it's talking about, or the author might not understand what they're talking about, and yet it still might get upvotes because passerbys might still think it's helpful, even if it's not really. Reddit's other problem with this is that it's very difficult for an artist there to respond to critique without getting downvoted unless they are completely in agreement with it 100% of the time. If they disagree with any aspect of the critique, they'll usually wind up getting downvoted from everything that I have seen. And this, honestly, the concept of upvotes and downvotes wouldn't really necessarily be an issue if everything was just displayed chronologically. But that's not a default setting for Reddit, and as a result, it really is not effective as a critiquing platform. YouTube likewise has a similar problem with this. It's not as bad because comments are a lot more transient here, but somebody who's popular can make a statement about something, and strictly because of their popularity, their statement will wind up rising up to the top, and they'll get likes and features on that strictly because of their popularity. It's less of an issue because it's not necessarily going to stay there permanently, and usually if somebody is popular on YouTube, this might sound completely biased, but they have a better chance of knowing what they're talking about, so they're more likely to give a good critique at least. It's not fair that their critique is going to be at the top necessarily, strictly because of their popularity, but at least it's going to likely be a bit better than normal. Than the average commenter anyway. Alright, now on to reading some comments. And this is on my last video. Keith Schwerin asks, generally when I hear something like your first example/story, it typically is from someone younger that doesn't seem to understand that paid commissions are a thing, and in their head thinks for some reason that you're just another kid about their age that likes to draw stuff. And to be honest, that oftentimes happens, but I've seen some people making absurd requests, and these people were in their 30s. So sometimes happens, but there are definitely cases where that is not the case. Deletion D asks, what tablet do you use? I use an Intuos 4, I believe it's a very large size. It's not manufactured anymore. I don't even think Wacom makes Intuos models that big anymore. Intuos is the kind that doesn't have the screen on it. Cintiqs are the kind with a screen. I personally prefer not having a screen because my hand coordination is actually pretty good and I can position it a little bit more freely. And it's so freaking big as well. It only cost me $300 to get as well. Normally it would be like $600 or $700 back in its heyday. Enri Sonohara asks if she can draw fan art of my characters, and totally! I love fan art. Alright, well that about wraps up this video. I hope you enjoyed watching me draw Tuki and animating her, and talking about critique and stuff. This one went on for a little bit longer, but I think it's suiting in this case. If you want to get in contact with me, I've got a Tumblr, linked below. I've also got a Twitter, and now I've got a Facebook page as well, so go and follow me there or some shit. Or don't. I don't really care. I do, actually. Please follow me. Okay. Yeah. Have a good one.